Okay, so the weaknesses of those three wars: Queen Anne's wars, King George's war, King William's war. What weaknesses showed up in the colonies? In the colonies because of those wars. What things? What are some things?
Like a lack of materials.
Okay, yeah, there was definitely a lack of materials, but right, that the resources were limited. Okay, lack of resources, especially in like Europe, they had a lack of resources. And what else? What were some other issues?
Finances.
Okay, finances, that does play an important role. How they get troops over the seas. Right, that was a weakness. Again, if one group could finance the war and the other one couldn't, then they would have a strategic advantage. What did it tell us about the weaknesses in those colonies? What did some of those wars and those battles and those scrimmages that took place in those settlements, what did it tell us about their weaknesses? What was lacking? What was lacking in the colonies?
Unity.
Yeah, there was a lack of unity in the colonies, right? And that's not good if you're going to war in any manner, right? You don't want half of the colonies like, hey, I don't care, I'm not invested in it, it doesn't bother me. That's a problem for the other people, right? If that's the case, then you're not going to have a good backing. You don't want to ever go to war and not be united in some way. So there was a lack of unity. What else was there a lack of? What else was there a lack of in the colonies?
Organization.
Yeah, organization, and even to the degree, right? You're only as good as your leaders, right? They like quality leadership. And so these are some of the issues that come up when we look at these wars, right? The King George's War, Queen Anne's War, all the ones that we did yesterday, right? These were a European affair, right? And we learned that there's stuff happening between the French and the British in Europe that were carried over to the colonies. Today, when we look at the French and Indian War, this is a conflict that started here. It started in the Americas. This is different from all those other battles, right? The conflict started in the Americas. And so those issues that we saw brought up are going to, again, repeat themselves, and right, they're going to be seen again. So in your notes that you have, or in maybe another part of your note, I want you to create that T-chart. And we're going to look at the strengths and weaknesses that both groups, right, the French and Indians and the British and Americans, are bringing to this war in the American colonies. Okay? So that's what we'll be doing. We'll be walking through that together. So we do need to be in the right place. And the right place is page 90 in our textbook. Okay? So we'll make this list together. You'll want, again, I'm going to be writing that up on the board. Anytime you see me writing something on the board, that should be an indicator that you need to write something down too. Okay? I shouldn't have to tell you, oh, yeah, write this down. You should just know that's what needs to be done. Okay? So this is a T-chart. We're going to highlight the strengths and the weaknesses of both sides. Okay? So it says, although the French and the King William's War and Queen Anne's War and King George's War was all sometimes referred as the French and Indian Wars, the title French and Indian War is reserved for the decisive conflict fought from 1754 to 1763, in contrast to the earlier, primarily European conflict the French and Indian War began in the New World and spread to Europe, right? It's opposite, it's beginning in the New World and spreading to Europe. Where war broke out officially in 1756, it became known as the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 63. So, 9 years in the American colonies, okay? That's how long it took place in the American colonies, right? And 7 years in Europe. That's where it gets the name 7 Years' War in Europe. We call it the French and Indian War. It actually lasted longer because it started in the Americas. Okay? Again, it's the two opposing world powers at the time, French and the British. The 7 Years' War eventually saw Britain and Prussia allied against Austria, Russia, and France and Spain, and several other nations. With fighting on 3 continents among several nations, not to mention the participation of both Asian and American Indians, there was war, perhaps the First World War. The conflict began in the backwoods of western Pennsylvania, and a small incident involving a 22-year-old Virginia colonel named
Virginia Day.
George Washington, right? So the person that gets blamed for the French and Indian War is the first president of the United States, George Washington. Young kid at the time, colonel. Yeah. Okay. So George Washington has a major role in this conflict. Okay. The guy that we look to as the first president, as the leader of our country, has started this incident between France and Britain. Right? And he went under the direction of the governor of Virginia at the time, so it wasn't like he was just out there trying to start something. Right? He was following orders. So let's look at the spark. Okay? The spark that took place. In the spring of 1754, Lieutenant Colonel George Washington led a men towards the forks of the Ohio River, which is the site of Pittsburgh. Okay? This is where it takes place, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Governor Dinwiddie, so fun name to say, Dinwiddie, okay, of Virginia, had ordered Washington to clear the territory of the French, who, according to the English, had illegally entered the area. So we talked about this, right? France and Britain both made claims to parts of the United States of America. Well, I guess there weren't the United States yet, but again, American territories. They're going to clash, right? When people are moving and spreading out, they're going to clash. And so this Virginia governor is, again, trying to take claim and protect what he believes to be British and his colony's land. Okay? So he had illegally entered the area. On the way, Washington and his troops surprised a small group of Frenchmen and French soldiers. In the ensuing scrimmage, the Frenchmen were killed and captured. And Britain and France were technically in a time of peace. If you know anything about that, that's never a good thing to happen, right? When war or a scrimmage or a battle takes place and the two countries are at peace, that doesn't look good, right? It doesn't look good on the side that started it mainly, okay? So, George Washington's going to learn a lesson here as a young individual. A much larger force of French soldiers and Indian warriors, however, was waiting for him at the forks of the Ohio River at the newly constructed Fort Duquesne. Realizing that he was outnumbered, Washington retreated hastily and threw up defenses, aptly named Fort Necessity. The structure shows that Washington, inexperienced, located in a low area in a fort that the French to fire directly into from the heights. Washington was soon forced to surrender, but the French were surprisingly gracious. They allowed the Virginians to march home, and after Washington naively signed a note of surrender that put the blame on the whole affair on the British. The government repudiated Washington's note, and Britain and France went to war. Okay, so Britain didn't want to take blame for it. France wanted to blame Britain for it. And so war between France and Britain began in the American colonies because, again, George Washington's interaction there in Pennsylvania. So let's look at the two sides, how they shape up. This is where you want to start noting some things. In the early stages of the war, the French enjoyed a friendlier relationship with the native Indian allies, and the British had with their Iroquois allies. So, the French, right, had strong native allies, strong allies with the natives. The British, I mean, they had a strong allegiance with the Iroquois, or alliance. So natives were, right, again, a part of this war. The French also had an important advantage in that they understood the Indians and Indian warfare better than the British had. The French borrowed methods of forest fighting from the Indians and practiced guerrilla warfare. So that's a major advantage, is guerrilla tactics. What does it mean by guerrilla warfare?
Surprise attacks.
Yes, surprise attacks. What else?